So now we're going to move from the flows and just the really rough sketch screen designs that you had to start to specific screen designs to get you to a paper prototype that you can run a usability study on in the next class. So we need to think about how to design a series of screens, how to design a screen so that people will be able to understand what's displayed on it and get their task accomplished. So there are 8 principles that Wodka has on designing screens. Designing for wayfinding. So when someone looks at your screen, they should be able to figure out where they are, where they can go, and how to get there. Users should never feel lost in a process. If you have a wizard-like interaction where they need to maybe complete 3 or 4 screens to get a task done, make that clear. Say this is step 1 of 3. Say this is step 2 of 3. Offer a way to back out if they decide they don't want to complete that task. All of that is really, really important for setting up wayfinding. Make it easy so people can figure out how to get home, how to get to the first screen of your application where they might be able to pick among multiple tasks to accomplish. Another principle is to set expectations and provide feedback. So make it very clear, again, that there's 3 or 4 steps in a given flow, and provide feedback along the way. I mean, whether it's just saying, great, you're almost there, or if someone provides some input that isn't valid, putting some feedback in right away so that they know that the phone number field has to have only numbers or something like that, right? Just make it very clear along the way if someone's doing something that isn't going to be allowed in your system. So they don't get all the way to the end of the flow and then it's like, oh, you need to go back to step 2 and fix something. Just make it very clear along the way with feedback. This is also important the first time someone comes into an application. You might want to have a little tutorial that just highlights certain features of your application, certain buttons that they can click on, certain styles of navigation that you've chosen to use, so that when someone first comes to the app, they know how to use it, and they know how to interact with various parts of it. And they might know some of the advanced features that they might never find on their own, but you could highlight it with one of these first-time use wizards or tutorials. It's important to think about ergonomics. Don't put a little tiny button way on the top of the phone that someone isn't going to be able to reach across with their thumb and press. Think about having targets that are big enough for people to press, for example, if they're on a bus or a train, something that's really bumpy. Don't put 2 really, really tiny buttons right next to each other or 2 really small clickable text areas right next to each other. People have big thumbs and are bouncing around in all forms of transit, and so make sure you have clear separation between each of your clickable elements and that people can actually use them when they're out in the world in less than ideal situations. Think about standards. Again, think about your platform. Be consistent with the operating system that you're designing for. Don't use iOS paradigms on Android. You'll just confuse all the poor Android users. The same on iOS. Don't use kind of the Android style of menus and options on iOS, where that's not the way users are expecting to interact with their applications. Provide error support. Hopefully make it so it's very hard for people to even induce an error. If you have a text box where they can only put in numbers, use a number-based keyboard. Don't bring up the full QWERTY keyboard if you're asking someone to just enter numbers in a certain text field, right? So try to prevent errors from ever happening, but if they do occur, make sure you inform the user. You can pre-cache data, so if the network's not available, you can show something. But if the network's not available and they're doing some action that requires connecting to the network, tell them about that. Bring up a toast, bring up a dialog box, bring up something that says, the network is not available, we weren't able to complete your task, please try again later, get to an area with better coverage, right? There are lots of things you can say in one of these error dialogues so that somebody sees what they need to do in order to get into a situation where they can use your app successfully. Rely on recognition rather than recall. So don't have a big, long, complicated introduction tutorial and then assume everybody remembers every detail from that and can use your app perfectly from then on. Make sure that someone coming to the app new that doesn't have that tutorial or went through it maybe a month ago when they interacted with your app can still recognize where they need to go and what they need to interact with. And this is, again, using a lot of platform standards. Use the standard menu icon to indicate a menu. Use the standard paradigms for swiping to get back and forth between different parts of your application for your individual platform. And remember that you'll have people of varying skill levels using your system. So don't design it just for the expert if you imagine that all sorts of people will be using your system. Not everyone can read a graph, not everybody is perfectly literate and able to understand long paragraphs of text. Think about your users, think about the abilities that they'll have when they come to the system, as well as familiarity with the platform. Someone might have just bought their iPhone yesterday and your app was the first one they downloaded. They might not know all of the interaction paradigms of iOS yet, and they should still be able to use your system. And then provide meaningful and contextual help and documentation. Make sure that somebody can get help when they need it. They know where to go to get certain tasks done. Maybe they can rerun that first-time use tutorial so that they can be reminded of how to use the system later if they've forgotten. Just make sure that people are never completely lost and then just abandon your system. So think about the screens, think about the screen design, and what we'll have you create now are a series of wireframes. And a wireframe is basically just a drawing of what the screen looks like without any of the rich media. So you don't have a rich background, you don't have all the icons and stuff in place. It's really just a hand-drawn sketch of what a screen will look like. Here are some examples of ones we created in Illustrator, but you can imagine just creating these by hand if you just want to quickly sketch something out. We'll show some examples of that with the usability study in a few minutes. But this shows some of the screens we created for the phone book. So now you can see some of that interaction design being shown in the screens. You can see a user and you can see the different facets of their entry in the phone book, where you can swipe between recent updates and contact information and communication history for that user. You can see how you can scroll between the different views of your whole contact list, from A to Z to recent updates to people nearby. You can see that for a given user, you can choose which way you want to communicate with them. You could call, you could send a text message, you could send a Facebook message, you could tweet at them. You can interact in a whole variety of different ways. You could write on their Facebook wall. All of this was available right from the phone book. And these screens were the first time we started to really look at what does that interaction look like? What does the detail of the screen that will enable you to do all of those different use cases? So again, think about some of the abilities your platform gives you. Think about some gestures that users might be able to use, both touch gestures as well as kind of shaking or accelerometer-based gestures that people might use to interact with your system. Think about the ability to pull down something and get more information. Think about the ability to swipe into something for more information. And think about how those screens are designed, how people can interact with them, and how your particular platform lays out information. So now we'd like you to go and take that next step. Look at each of your flows, look at each of the screens in your flows, and really detail out what that screen looks like. Make sure you're using the platform conventions of the particular operating system you're designing for, and just sketch them out really roughly. Use a Sharpie, a marker on an index card. Index cards are kind of perfect because they're about the size of a phone screen. So if you can just get a set of index cards on each one, draw out a screen really quickly, draw out all the screens in your interface, and that will get you ready to run a usability study and see how people perform tasks on those paper screens that you've created.